Margaret Adebayo, a 36-year-old woman, lived a simple life in the small town of Brighton, in rural Oregon. Married to Stephen for 12 years, she dedicated her days to caring for her 5 children. Clara, aged 11, Joshua, 9, twins Ivy and Isla, 6, and little Benjamin, just 3. Margaret always believed that, despite financial difficulties, love and mutual support would sustain her family. That belief was shattered one gray afternoon, when Stephen returned from work, with a hard expression and an avoidant look, to announce that he was leaving. Without much explanation, he left, leaving Margaret alone to deal with the children and the accumulated bills. The pain of betrayal mixed with the panic of survival. Brighton was a small town, where job opportunities were limited and judgmental looks came from all sides. Margaret, who had dropped out of college to focus on her family, felt unprepared to face the world alone. Still, she didn't allow herself to succumb to sadness. Her children depended on her, and she would do her best to make sure they didn't go hungry or lose the roof over their heads. Time seemed to be running against her. During the first few weeks, Margaret did small jobs, such as sewing and cleaning, but there was insufficient money. The pressure increased every day. The children's school charged late fees, and the house's electricity was cut off. Margaret realized she needed a steady job, even if it meant sacrificing more time with the kids. After an intense search, she managed to get an interview at the only factory in the city, specializing in the production of handcrafted furniture. It was a position like a worker without many training requirements, but requiring physical strength and endurance. Margaret knew it wasn't her dream job, but it was the only option. She needed to overcome the prejudice that a single mother would not be able to handle such a demanding job. On the day of the interview, Margaret arrived at the factory with shaking hands and a racing heart. The industrial corridors, noisy and filled with heavy machinery, seemed intimidating. The supervisor, a stern man named Henry Peterson, asked quick questions, not hiding the disdain in his expression. "You don't look strong enough for the job," he commented. Margaret, in a firm voice, replied, "You can give me a chance. I learn quickly and I don't give up." Against all expectations, she was hired. Henry, even though he was skeptical, agreed to give her the job, but made it clear that he wouldn't make anything easier for her. Margaret left the office with conflicting feelings. Relief at having a job and fear of what was to come. The first few days at the factory were a trial by fire for Margaret. The journey started early, at 6 a.m., and was marked by strenuous tasks. Carrying heavy boards, sanding wood for hours, and operating noisy machines that always seemed on the verge of breaking down was exhausting. Her hands, once soft from caring for her children, were now rough and full of calluses. Still, she refused to complain. Every time she thought about giving up, she remembered her children's faces and the silent promise to never fail them. Co-workers didn't make the situation any easier. Many mocked her inexperience and made cruel comments about her being just a mother trying to survive in such a difficult environment. Young Karen, a 22-year-old employee, frequently gave her dismissive looks and muttered things like, "She won't last a week." However, there was an older worker named Tomas, a Mexican immigrant who had worked there for 20 years. He was the only one who, from time to time, gave advice and encouraged her to continue. The nights were equally challenging. Margaret came home exhausted, but still had to help her children with their schoolwork, prepare dinner and put the children to bed. The physical and emotional exhaustion was devastating, but she found strength in her children's small gestures of affection. A drawing from Benjamin or a hug from the twins was enough to renew her determination. One morning, while struggling to adjust a complicated machine, Margaret heard muffled laughter in the background. It was Karen again, discreetly filming her difficulties and then showing the video to her other colleagues. Embarrassed but not defeated, Margaret ignored the provocation and continued working. She knew that her place in the factory would only be guaranteed if she proved her worth. During the afternoon shift, Margaret was assigned a particularly difficult task, carving an intricate detail into a piece of wood. She had never done anything so delicate before, and under Henry's critical eye, she began the work with trembling hands. Sweat ran down her face as she concentrated on the task. When he finished, Henry analyzed the result with a neutral expression. Acceptable was all he said before leaving Margaret with a mixture of relief and frustration. The days turned into weeks, and Margaret began to develop a rhythm. Despite the adversities, she was persistent and determined. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Tomas approached and said, "You have more talent than you know, Margaret. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words, simple but sincere, stuck in her mind, planting a seed of confidence she didn't know she needed. Margaret Adebayo was a 36-year-old woman, living in the quiet town of Brighton, in the state of Oregon. Her life revolved around her family, her husband, Stephen, and her 5 children, Clara, Joshua, Ivy, Isla, and little Benjamin. For her, happiness was in the little things, like the moments when she cooked pancakes on Sundays or the afternoons when she read stories to the children. However, this peaceful life suffered a devastating blow one night in March. Stephen, visibly nervous, confessed that he was leaving the family. "I can't take it anymore," he said, before walking out the door without looking back. The impact was immediate. Margaret felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The feeling of betrayal and abandonment was mixed with the despair of being alone with 5 young children. Home, once a place of safety and love, now felt cold and oppressive. The bills piled on the kitchen table were a cruel reminder that the future would be bleak. Despite the internal chaos, Margaret knew she could not give in to panic. "They need me," he thought as he looked at his children, who still didn't understand the gravity of the situation. The first few weeks were a test of emotional endurance. Margaret tried to hold on to the family's savings, but they quickly ran out. She began doing small sewing and cleaning jobs for her neighbors, but the money was barely enough to buy food. Each night was an exercise in containment. She would lock herself in her room to cry silently, while her children slept in the other room. Still, he didn't allow himself to fall apart during the day. His strength came from the unconditional love he felt for his children. At school, Clara began to hear malicious comments from classmates about her father's abandonment. Joshua, normally a happy boy, became introspective. Margaret realized that the suffering was not just hers. The children were feeling the weight of Stephen's absence. This motivated her to intensify her search for a permanent job, something that would bring stability. Brighton, however, did not offer many opportunities, especially for a woman without a university degree. After weeks of incessant searching, Margaret found a job advertisement at the only factory in the city, specializing in handcrafted furniture. The work was hard, but the requirements were minimal, and she decided to take a chance. On the morning of the interview, she dressed in the best clothes she had and rehearsed her answers on the way. Upon arriving, she felt intimidated by the environment. Noisy machines, the smell of freshly cut wood, and curious looks from the workers. It was a completely different world from the one she knew. Plant supervisor Henry Peterson didn't hide his skepticism. "Do you think you can handle this?" he asked, sizing Margaret up and down. She replied firmly, "I have no choice. I can learn quickly." Her determination surprised Henry, who decided to give her a chance, albeit reluctantly. The contract was temporary, but Margaret saw it as an opportunity to prove herself. When he returned home with the news, his children celebrated, even though they didn't fully understand what it meant. Margaret, on the other hand, knew this was just the beginning of a long road. During the night, she lay down exhausted, but felt a small spark of hope. It was difficult work, but it was a start. However, Margaret was also afraid. Fear of not being enough, of failing, of disappointing your children. This fear accompanied her until her first day of work. She knew she couldn't show weakness, as the environment in the factory seemed hostile. Henry's comments still echoed in her mind, and she knew she would have to work harder than anyone else to keep that job. Looking at her sleeping children, Margaret promised herself she would never give up. No matter how difficult it was, she would find a way to turn this situation around. Brighton was a small town, but its determination was greater than any obstacle that could arise. She was about to begin a journey that would not only change her life, but also the lives of everyone around her. The first day at the factory was exhausting. Margaret arrived before sunrise, wearing a uniform that looked bigger than she was. The atmosphere was chaotic. Electric saws cutting wood, moving forklifts, and the strong smell of varnish filling the air. As soon as she entered, she realized she was out of her comfort zone. The other workers watched her with curiosity mixed with disdain, and no one offered to help her get used to it. Henry handed him a clipboard with the day's tasks, without even making eye contact. Margaret was assigned to carry wooden planks from one section to another. The seemingly simple task proved to be a challenge. The boards were heavy, and his arms, unaccustomed to so much physical effort, began to hurt in the first few minutes. She sweated as she tried to keep up with her classmates, but she didn't give up. Every step she took was motivated by thoughts of her children and what it meant to have food on the table. Coworkers didn't make it easy. Karen, a 22-year-old with a sarcastic smile, was the most vocal in her criticism. "She won't last a week," he commented, loud enough for Margaret to hear. The laughter that followed was a blow to her pride, but she remained silent. Among the workers, only Tomas, an older and more experienced man, showed any kindness. He walked her through some tasks and said, "Just ignore it. You are here for a greater reason." However, the routine wasn't just physical. It was emotionally draining. Margaret arrived home late, exhausted, and still had to take care of her children. Preparing dinner, helping with schoolwork, and listening to the day's stories took up the rest of his energy. Clara, noticing her mother's tiredness, started helping more around the house, something that deeply touched Margaret. Still, there were times when she felt like she was failing to be the mother her children deserved. At the factory, Margaret faced new challenges daily. One afternoon, she was assigned to operate a machine she had never used before. Afraid of making a mistake, she asked Henry for directions, but he just rolled his eyes and said, "Figure it out for yourself." Trembling, Margaret tried to understand how the machine worked. She made mistakes, but she persevered, and at the end of the shift, she managed to complete the task. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret began to notice changes in herself. His arms, once fragile, now showed signs of strength. Her stamina increased, and she was more confident in her abilities. Even so, the derogatory comments from Karen and others still affected her. In a moment of weakness, Margaret almost gave up, but Tomas's words echoed in her mind. "You are here for a greater reason." One night, as she reflected on her journey, Margaret realized that her determination was growing. She was still not accepted by her colleagues, but she knew she was building something important for herself and her children. Each callus on her hands was a symbol of her struggle, and she was beginning to understand that true strength came from within. At the end of the shift on a Thursday, Henry, always critical, watched Margaret as she carved a detail into a piece of wood. To his surprise, he found no faults. He didn't say anything, but Margaret caught a faint nod of approval. This small gesture was enough to give him more motivation to face the next day. Even facing daily challenges, Margaret remained focused. Her children noticed her dedication and began to admire her in a new way. Without realizing it, Margaret was becoming not only a resilient mother, but also an example of strength and determination. Margaret had already been at the factory for 2 months, but the feeling of contempt persisted. The co-workers, led by Karen, continued to make fun of their difficulties. Even when you completed a task correctly, someone found a reason to criticize or minimize your effort. "You only made it because you were lucky," Karen once commented, upon seeing Margaret finish a complicated piece. These comments fueled the insecurity that Margaret still carried, but she remained focused, trying hard to ignore the provocations. Henry also seemed determined to constantly test her. Whenever Margaret delivered a piece of work, he examined it with a cold and critical eye, looking for errors even where there were none. "If you want to stay here, you need to improve," he said, even when the work was impeccable. Margaret, despite being frustrated, responded with a simple "I'll do better," suppressing the urge to retort. She knew that arguing would only reinforce their view of her as incapable. Meanwhile, the workload remained heavy. Margaret was often assigned to tasks that required physical strength beyond her initial capabilities. such as carrying large quantities of boards to the polishing department. She realized that these duties were not distributed equally among employees, but she accepted the challenge, determined to prove that she was capable. Every time I completed a difficult task, I felt a small internal victory, even though I wasn't recognized for it. The days passed slowly, but Margaret began to realize something important. While others mocked, she learned. With each task, I developed new skills. She studied the behavior of machines, observed the finishing details on furniture, and even began to identify flaws in the work of other colleagues. Still, he kept what he learned silent, as he feared that any demonstration of knowledge could be seen as arrogance. At home, Margaret tried not to let the factory's problems affect her relationship with her children. She did her best to offer them moments of affection and normality. Clara, who was already perceptive for her age, began to ask about the job. "Mommy, are they good with you there?" Margaret hesitated to answer, but opted for the partial truth. "Not always. But I'm there for you." These conversations strengthened the bond between mother and daughter and helped Margaret stay strong. However, the emotional pressure began to take its toll on Margaret. She slept little, worried about the bills and the possibility of losing her job. "I often woke up in the middle of the night, thinking about Henry's criticism or Karen's laughter. These sleepless nights were accompanied by physical pain, the result of excessive effort at the factory." Margaret felt like her body was at its limit, but she knew she couldn't afford to stop. One day, Margaret noticed something curious. As she did a thorough polishing job, she noticed Karen watching her more closely than usual. For the first time, the colleague's expression did not seem to be one of contempt, but of curiosity. Margaret didn't know how to interpret this, but she felt something was changing. Perhaps her persistence was starting to bother those who underestimated her. Later that same day, Margaret was called into Henry's office. Her heart skipped a beat, fearing she was about to be fired. When she entered, she found Henry with a piece of wood in his hands, the same one she had polished. "Your work is starting to look good," he said, dryly but directly. That was the closest thing to a compliment she had received since she started. Margaret nodded her thanks, but inside she felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. Even with this small recognition, Margaret knew the road was still long. The environment remained hostile, but his confidence was growing. She began to realize that despite the difficulties, she was building a reputation as someone who was resilient. More importantly, she was proving to herself that she was stronger than she believed. That night, when she got home, Margaret looked at her calloused hands and felt proud. For the first time in a long time, she not only saw the sacrifices, but also the achievements. Despite the adversity, she was moving forward, and that was all that mattered. One morning, Margaret was assigned a task that would change the course of her career at the factory. Henry had decided that she would work in the section of carving fine details into furniture, a job that required precision, patience, and a keen aesthetic sense. Normally, only the most experienced employees were in charge of this, but for some reason, Henry decided to test it. Margaret felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. It was a chance to show off his skills, but also a huge responsibility. As she approached the sculpting bench, Margaret noticed the presence of Tomas, who was there to guide her. He explained the basic techniques and handed you a simple tool to get started. Margaret watched carefully and, with trembling hands, began the work. The wood seemed to resist the initial touch, but over time it found a rhythm. Each careful stroke of the tool created a design that began to take shape. It was a slow process, but Margaret felt a strange satisfaction in seeing the progress. As she worked, Margaret began to remember her childhood. She grew up in a family of amateur carpenters, and her father used to teach her how to create small wooden objects on the weekends. Although he hadn't practiced for many years, those memories now seemed alive, guiding his hands. Tomas, who was watching closely, noticed something different. "You have a natural talent," he said, with an encouraging smile. Margaret blushed, not knowing how to respond. The day passed quickly, and at the end of the shift, Margaret handed her first carved piece to Henry. He examined the work in silence, which made her apprehensive. After a few minutes, he simply said, "Good start." It was more than she expected to hear, and Margaret left the factory that day with new energy. For the first time, he felt like he could do something meaningful there. However, not everyone was impressed. Karen, ever observant, threw out a sarcastic comment. "Don't get too excited. One good piece won't change anything." Margaret ignored it, but the words still echoed in her mind. She knew she would have to prove her skill again and again before respect was earned. Over the next few weeks, Margaret continued working in the sculpture section. Each piece he produced was an opportunity to learn and perfect his technique. Little by little, he began experimenting with more complex designs, adding unique details that caught the attention of Tomas and, eventually, Henry. Despite this, Margaret remained humble, recognizing that she still had much to learn. One afternoon, Margaret decided to stay late to finish a special project. She was so immersed in her work that she didn't notice Henry approaching. He watched in silence as Margaret carved with precision and creativity. When she finally looked up, she found the supervisor looking at the piece with a puzzled expression. "You have talent," he admitted. It was the first time Margaret had heard these words from Henry, and they had a profound impact. Over time, the pieces carved by Margaret began to stand out in the factory's production. Some customers even directly praised the work, which didn't go unnoticed by Henry. Despite this, Margaret still faced resistance from some colleagues, but now something was different. She knew she had value. Discovering her ability brought a new perspective to Margaret. For the first time, she began to see work not just as an obligation, but as an opportunity for personal growth. At the end of the month, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She was transforming her life one piece of wood at a time. Margaret continued to work in the sculpture section, becoming more and more confident in her abilities. What had previously seemed impossible had now become natural, and his previously inexperienced hands shaped the wood with precision and delicacy. Over time, the pieces she produced began to attract more attention within the factory. Some of the more experienced workers, previously indifferent, began to observe what she did, although without admitting it in words. Margaret noticed the looks, but preferred to stay focused on her work. She knew that verbal recognition was still a long way off, but actions were beginning to speak louder. Henry, always reserved in his assessments, began to assign Margaret to more complex work. It was a clear sign of trust, even if undeclared. One day, he called her into his office and delivered a detailed drawing of a special piece that would be sent to an important client. "I want you to do this," he said bluntly. Margaret felt a mixture of anxiety and pride. This represented a greater responsibility, but also a chance to prove his worth. The project was challenging, requiring a level of precision she had not yet experienced. Margaret spent hours studying the drawing before starting. Each stroke needed to be perfect, and she knew that any mistake could compromise the work. During the days that followed, she worked tirelessly, even refusing lunch breaks. Tomas, always attentive, offered help, but Margaret insisted on doing everything herself. "I need to show what I'm capable of," she explained, with determination. When she was finally finished, Margaret handed the piece to Henry. He examined every detail carefully, without expressing any emotions. After long minutes, I just said, "Good job." It was a simple compliment, but coming from Henry, it meant a lot. Margaret left the office with a small smile, feeling that she had taken an important step. That moment marked a subtle but significant change in his relationship with his supervisor. The piece was sent to the customer, who, days later, sent extremely positive feedback. Henry called all the workers to a meeting and read the message out loud, highlighting the quality of the work. Although she didn't mention Margaret directly, she knew the recognition was for her. Some colleagues, like Tomas, quietly congratulated her, while others, including Karen, avoided the topic. Margaret, however, did not need everyone's approval. For her, success spoke for itself. Despite progress, challenges have not disappeared. Karen continued to hurl derogatory comments, now focusing on the idea that Margaret was trying to steal attention. On one occasion, Karen suggested that Henry was favoring Margaret. "Why does she get the best assignments now?" he asked, in a mocking tone. Margaret heard the comment but chose not to react. She knew her dedication was the real reason behind the changes. In addition to the criticism, Margaret also faced the challenge of balancing work and family. The children felt her absence during the long shifts, and Clara, especially, began to express longing. "You work so hard, Mommy," she said one night. Margaret explained that she was doing it for them, but the conversation left her feeling guilty. She promised herself that she would find ways to be more present, even if it meant sacrificing her few moments of rest. At the factory, Margaret continued to surprise. In an unexpected moment, one of the company's most important customers visited the production. He went directly to the sculpture section and, upon seeing a piece made by Margaret, asked who had made it. Henry reluctantly pointed at her. The client, impressed, gave several compliments and asked Margaret to work on a new exclusive project. It was a milestone in his career, as, for the first time, his talent was being recognized outside the factory. This external recognition began to change the dynamics within the factory. Some colleagues started to respect her more, albeit silently. Tomas, always a supporter, commented, "You're leaving your mark here, Margaret." She was grateful, but knew there was still a lot to achieve. Recent success has brought new motivation, but also greater responsibility. As she progressed, Margaret began to realize that it wasn't just about doing a good job. It was about inspiring those around him, especially his children. Each victory at the factory represented a lesson in resilience and determination that she hoped they would absorb. Margaret felt like she was not only changing her own life, but also building a better future for her family. One morning, Margaret was surprised by news that would change the course of her life at the factory. Henry announced that the company would participate in a regional artisanal furniture fair, an important event where the best pieces would be showcased to potential customers and investors. "We need to submit our best work," he said, looking at Margaret. She immediately understood what that meant. Her sculptures would be displayed. Her heart raced, torn between nervousness and excitement. The piece chosen for the fair would be a coffee table with hand-carved details. Henry entrusted Margaret with the responsibility of creating the decorative carvings. It was a task of great importance, as it represented the factory's image to the public. Margaret knew that this was the biggest challenge of her career to date, but also a unique opportunity to showcase her talent beyond the factory walls. Over the next few days, Margaret immersed herself in the project. "I spent hours studying the design, adjusting every detail and making sure everything was perfect." Tomas and other colleagues watched her with silent admiration. Even Karen, who rarely offered any positive words, seemed impressed by Margaret's dedication. Although he didn't say anything, his change in behavior was noticeable. Margaret realized, with some surprise, that she was gaining respect even from those who had disdained her. As she worked, Margaret reflected on how she got here. What began as a desperate need to provide for her children had now become a passion. Each carving in the wood seemed to represent a part of his journey. The difficulties, the tears, but also the achievements. She began to realize that the factory was not just a place to work, but an environment where she was reinventing herself. Finally, the delivery day arrived. Margaret presented the finished table to Henry, who sat in silence for a few minutes, examining every detail. Finally, he turned to her and said, "You exceeded all expectations." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and pride. It was the recognition she had always sought, and hearing it from Henry was especially meaningful. The table was sent to the fair, and, to Margaret's surprise, it was immediately highlighted. Visitors were impressed by the carved details, and many asked who created the design. When Henry mentioned Margaret's name, the reaction was one of admiration. Some customers insisted on meeting her in person, but Henry explained that she was busy at the factory. Margaret found out about these compliments from Tomas, who made a point of telling every detail. Success at the fair brought a new wave of respect within the factory. Henry, who had always been reserved, began to entrust more important tasks to Margaret. Tomas suggested that she teach other workers the techniques she had developed, and for the first time, Margaret considered the idea of sharing her knowledge. "If I can do it, they can too," he thought, feeling a growing desire to help. On the other hand, success also brought challenges. Karen, who had previously been openly hostile, now tried to get closer to Margaret, but her intentions were unclear. Margaret, always cautious, kept her distance but was still polite. She knew that her journey was not yet complete, and that she would need to continue proving her worth every day. Despite everything, Margaret felt she was at a turning point. Hard work, persistence, and the desire to overcome adversity were starting to pay off. Not only had she earned her place at the factory, but she had also become an inspiration to her children and, in some ways, to her colleagues. It was the beginning of a new phase, and Margaret was ready to embrace everything that came her way. After her success at the regional fair, Margaret began to notice changes around her. The factory won new contracts thanks to the attention his piece received, and Henry wasted no time in informing the team about the positive impact of this recognition. Although he rarely offered direct praise, it was clear that Margaret was at the center of this transformation. On the other hand, this success also brought an increase in expectations. Henry began entrusting Margaret with the most demanding tasks, while the other workers watched intently, some with admiration, others with envy. Karen, who had previously made sarcastic comments, now tried to get closer, offering help or giving superficial compliments. "I think you're really talented," she once said, with a smile that seemed forced. Margaret, although polite, remained cautious. He knew that not everyone was genuinely happy about his ascension. Tomas, on the other hand, continued to be a true ally, encouraging her to take advantage of the opportunities that arose. "You deserve this, Margaret. You worked hard to get here," he said. With increasing responsibility, Margaret's workload became almost unbearable. Henry began to demand shorter deadlines and even more complex tasks. Margaret, determined not to disappoint, began to sacrifice her few hours of rest. For weeks, she worked late into the night, both at the factory and at home, reviewing designs and refining her techniques. This began to affect his health. The pain in her arms and back became constant, and she began to lose weight. But for Margaret, these were small sacrifices compared to the well-being of her children. At home, Clara took on an even more active role. She helped the twins with their schoolwork, took care of Benjamin, and even prepared small meals for the family. Margaret felt proud of her daughter's maturity, but also guilty for putting so much weight on her shoulders. "Mommy, you're doing something amazing," Clara said one night, trying to cheer her up. These words, simple but sincere, gave Margaret the strength she needed to continue. Margaret's success began to attract attention outside the factory. The story of a single mother who overcame adversity to become one of the region's leading artisans began to spread. Small local newspapers wrote articles about her, highlighting her resilience and talent. Margaret, although grateful for the recognition, was uncomfortable with the exposure. She never sought fame. All he wanted was to support his family and guarantee a future for his children. The attention brought new challenges within the factory. Some colleagues, especially Karen, began to insinuate that Margaret was enjoying privileges. In a heated exchange, Karen said, "It's not fair that you get all the credit. We're all here working hard." Margaret, surprised, replied calmly, "I never asked to be recognized. I just do my job." Tensions rose, but Margaret decided not to get involved any further. She knew her focus had to remain on her tasks and her family. Meanwhile, Henry, ever the pragmatist, began to explore the commercial opportunities that Margaret's success brought. He included her in meetings with important clients, where she presented her ideas for new projects. Although nervous at first, Margaret was confident and articulate, earning her even more respect. Henry, for the first time, began to treat her as an equal, consulting her on important decisions. However, fame also brought internal questions to Margaret. She began to wonder if she was moving away from her values and the original purpose of her work. Was he letting himself get carried away by recognition, or was he really doing what was best for his family? These doubts kept her awake at night, but they also motivated her to reflect on her next steps. A turning point occurred when Margaret received an unexpected proposal. A businessman from another city, impressed with his work, offered him a position at a larger company with a higher salary and better conditions. Margaret was tempted, but knew that accepting would mean leaving the factory and the colleagues who had become an important part of her journey. Furthermore, he would have to move with his children, something that was not easy to decide. With so many changes happening, Margaret felt like she was at a crossroads. His life, once defined by hardship, was now full of possibility. However, these choices carried an emotional weight she had never experienced. Margaret knew that no matter what decision she made, she needed to do what was best for her children and herself. The businessman's proposal arrived at a time when Margaret was already exhausted. The long shifts, constant pressure, and rising expectations were taking their toll. On the other hand, the opportunity to start something new, in a possibly more welcoming environment, seemed tempting. Margaret spent days reflecting on the decision, weighing the pros and cons. Clara, always observant, noticed her mother's dilemma. "You don't have to decide alone, Mom. We're here to help," she said, surprising Margaret with her maturity. The first person Margaret talked to about the proposal was Tomas. He was silent for a moment before saying, "You must do what is best for you and your family. But remember, Margaret, you built something here. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Those words stuck in her mind as she considered the change. At the factory, Henry also noticed something was happening. He called Margaret in for a chat and, to her surprise, offered her a raise and more flexibility in her schedule in an attempt to keep her on the team. Margaret was torn. On the one hand, the new job offered better financial conditions, something crucial for the future of their children. On the other, she felt a strong attachment to the factory and the people who, despite the challenges, had become part of its history. Furthermore, moving to another city would mean taking the children away from the family environment and schools they attended. This decision seemed increasingly complex. During a silent night, Margaret decided to ask her children for their opinion. Gathered in the living room, she explained the situation carefully, avoiding overwhelming them with the more difficult details. Clara was the first to speak. "If it will make you happy, I think we should go." Joshua, however, expressed concern. "What about our friends? We're gonna have to start all over again." The twins and Benjamin were too young to fully understand, but Margaret realized the decision would affect everyone in different ways. The next day, Margaret decided to visit the factory outside of business hours. She walked through the empty halls, remembering her first few days there. Every machine, every piece of wood, and every familiar smell seemed to tell a part of his story. It was there that she overcame her biggest insecurities and discovered a talent she never imagined she had. At the end of her walk, Margaret realized that no matter where she was, her strength and abilities would always be with her. The following week, Margaret made her decision. He met with Henry and explained that he would accept the businessman's proposal. Henry was surprised, but also showed respect for her courage. "You deserve this, Margaret. I just hope you never forget where you came from," he said, shaking your hand for the first time. Margaret thanked him, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Leaving the factory wouldn't be easy, but she knew she was doing what was best for her family. The farewell was emotional. Tomas organized a small meeting for Margaret, where many of the workers, including Karen, gathered to thank her for her contribution. Karen, who had changed her stance, said, "I never imagined I would learn so much from you. Thank you for showing what it means to persist." An emotional Margaret replied, "We all have the strength to overcome challenges. I just did what needed to be done." As she left the factory for the last time, Margaret felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and nervousness for what came next. Her journey there had been marked by difficulties and achievements, and she knew she was ready to face new challenges. His children, although sad about the change, were excited about the possibility of a better future. Margaret promised them that wherever they went, they would remain together as a strong family. Upon arriving at the new company, Margaret was greeted with enthusiasm. The team was more diverse and the environment was more welcoming. She quickly realized that her skills were valued in ways she had never experienced before. Despite this, Margaret always remembered the factory in Brighton as the place where it all began. Over time, Margaret not only thrived in her new position, but also became a mentor to other women facing similar challenges. Her story, marked by resilience and overcoming, has inspired many, both inside and outside the industry. Margaret proved that even in the most difficult situations, it was possible to find strength and create a better path for yourself and those you loved. Margaret soon excelled in her new position. The company where he started working had a modern approach, valuing not only the final product, but also the creativity and stories behind each piece. Her previous experience at the Brighton factory, combined with the natural talent she developed, made her a respected figure among her colleagues. She was assigned to lead special projects where she had the freedom to create unique designs. Although she felt challenged, Margaret realized that, for the first time, she was in an environment that encouraged her to grow and express herself fully. As her career progressed, Margaret did not forget where she came from. Whenever she was praised for her work, she made a point of sharing the story of how she got started. "Everything I know I learned from my struggles," he told his colleagues, reinforcing the idea that talent can emerge from the most adverse situations. These words inspired many people, especially other single mothers who worked at the company. Margaret, without realizing it, began to build a reputation not only as a talented artisan, but also as a mentor. His relationship with his children also underwent a transformation. With her new job, Margaret was able to reorganize her routine to be more present at home. Although she still worked long hours, she made a point of making time to have dinner with her children and hear about their day. Clara, who had always been his biggest supporter, began to express interest in following in her mother's footsteps. "I want to create beautiful things like you, Mommy," she said one night, filling Margaret with pride. The impact of Margaret's work began to go beyond the company's walls. One of her clients, impressed by a piece she had designed, asked for permission to share her story at a design event. Margaret was hesitant at first, as she still didn't feel comfortable with the idea of exposing herself publicly. However, encouraged by Clara and Tomas, who kept in touch with her even from a distance, Margaret accepted. The event was a success, and his story of overcoming moved the audience. "Your trajectory shows that talent and resilience can change lives," said the client in his speech. After the event, Margaret began to receive invitations to speak at other similar occasions. Although she never imagined being a speaker, she realized that her story had a positive impact on many people. Little by little, she began to accept these opportunities, using her voice to encourage women in difficult situations. In each lecture, he emphasized the importance of believing in yourself and never underestimating your own potential. For Margaret, this was more than recognition. It was a way of giving back. At the new company, Margaret also began to develop collaborative projects. He worked with renowned designers, learned new techniques, and expanded his vision of working with wood. This exchange of experiences not only enriched his work, but also reinforced his confidence. Each piece he created was a reminder of his journey, of where he started and everything he had overcome to get there. Margaret was building a legacy, both for her children and for the industry in which she now excelled. Meanwhile, at the old Brighton factory, his absence was felt. Henry, who had never shown affection openly, sent her a letter thanking her for everything she had done. He admitted that he initially doubted her abilities, but that she had surprised him in ways he had never imagined. Margaret was moved by the message, as she knew that, even from a distance, her impact was still recognized. "Thank you for never giving up," he wrote at the end, words that Margaret kept like a trophy. Margaret began planning something special, a visit to the old factory to meet up with her old colleagues and share what she had learned. When the day arrived, she was greeted enthusiastically by Tomas and other workers who still remembered her fondly. Karen, who was also present, apologized for her past behavior. "You taught me more than I could ever admit," Karen said, sincerely. Margaret accepted the request with a smile and used the moment to reinforce that everyone was capable of overcoming challenges. The reunion was a reminder of how Margaret's path was intertwined with that of many other people. The Brighton factory was where it all began, and she would always be grateful for the lessons she learned there. Ultimately, Margaret said goodbye with a promise to stay in touch and help the factory whenever possible. For her, that place was not just a place of work, but a landmark in her life. Upon returning home, Margaret reflected on how much had changed. From an insecure and underestimated woman, She became a reference in her field, as well as an inspiration for many people. His journey, although full of difficulties, had been marked by growth and overcoming. Margaret felt at peace, knowing that she was living not only to support her family, but also to make a difference in the world. Years passed, and Margaret continued to expand her career and her impact. She founded her own handcrafted furniture line called Adebayo Designs, in honor of his family. Each piece he created was unique, carrying a little of his story. Margaret made a point of employing women in vulnerable situations, offering them training and opportunities to grow. For her, this was the true meaning of success, using your achievements to help others reach their potential. Clara, now a teenager, became an apprentice at her mother's company. Margaret taught her patiently, passing on not only the techniques but also the values that guided her throughout her life. It's not just about creating something beautiful, she said, but about putting your soul into what you do. Clara demonstrated talent and dedication, and Margaret was proud to see her follow in her footsteps. Little by little, he began to envision Clara taking on a leadership role in the future. In addition to Clara, Margaret encouraged her other children to pursue their own dreams. Joshua showed an interest in engineering, while the twins, Ivy and Isla, showed an artistic inclination. Benjamin, the youngest, was curious and always asked questions about how the pieces were created. Margaret felt that, in some way, her work was influencing each of them to find their own passion. The speaking events continued, and Margaret became a recognized figure in her community and beyond. Her story was featured in magazines and television programs, but she always made a point of remembering that the focus was not on her fame, but on the lessons that her career could teach. "If I can do it, anyone can do it," he often repeated. These words, spoken sincerely, inspired thousands of people. Margaret also began traveling to other cities and even countries, sharing her experiences and learning from other cultures. Each trip brought new ideas and perspectives, which she incorporated into her work. Despite all the changes, Margaret remained connected to her roots. She often returned to Brighton to visit friends and family, keeping the connection with the place where her journey began alive. At a special event, Margaret was honored with an award for her contribution to the artisanal furniture industry and its social impact. Upon receiving the trophy, she gave an emotional speech. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice breaking. "It's about everyone who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. It's about my family, my colleagues, and every person who faced challenges and kept going." The audience gave a standing ovation, and Margaret felt more grateful than ever. Over the years, Margaret continued to invest in people. She created mentoring programs, offered workshops, and made donations to initiatives that supported single mothers and women in vulnerable situations. For her, the greatest legacy was not her company or her pieces, but the lives she could impact. Each success story that emerged from these projects was proof that their struggle had been worth it. At the end of her career, Margaret decided to hand over leadership of the company to Clara. The transition was emotional, marked by an event where staff and friends gathered to celebrate what Margaret had built. "Now it's your turn to take this forward," she told her daughter, emotionally. Clara promised to honor her mother's legacy, maintaining the values she always defended. Margaret, now with more time to herself, began writing a book about her journey. Entitled Between Tasks and Challenges, My Life in Madeira, the book became a success, reaching people around the world. Each chapter was a lesson in resilience, faith, and overcoming, which touched readers deeply. Looking back, Margaret felt accomplished. Her life hadn't been easy, but every obstacle had shaped her into who she was. More than an artisan or businesswoman, she was a woman who proved that, with determination and courage, it was possible to change your own destiny and inspire the world around you.